My name is Sophia, and I work as a marketing manager for a technology company in Boston. 6 years ago, my life changed when my older sister Lisa's marriage broke up. Their relationship with Mark, her husband, had been far from ideal for a long time, and although none of us knew all the details of their family problems, it was obvious that this union was based only on strained compromises and Lisa's patience. Mark has always been selfish and immature. He easily lost his temper over small things, not wanting to take responsibility for the family, and even more so for the upbringing of their son, Tyler. When the divorce was finalized, he practically disappeared from their lives, as if all those years of marriage had not happened, as if his son, who at that time was only 10 years old, was not his flesh and blood. I remember that period well. Lisa tried to hold on, to be strong, to pretend that she was coping, but it was clear that she was exhausted. She worked, but her salary was barely enough to pay the rent and support the child, and Mark, although he was obliged to pay alimony, regularly found excuses not to do so. He complained about financial difficulties, talked about sudden problems at work, but we knew that all these were just excuses. At first, he also called Tyler, promised to come, take him to the park or the cinema, but over time these calls became less frequent and then stopped altogether. The child was hopeful at first, then offended, and in the end just shut himself in. The forced move to our parents was an additional blow for him. He lost not only his father, but also his familiar home, his room, friends in the neighborhood, everything that creates a sense of stability in a child's life. Our parents, people of the old school, sacrificed their usual lives for the sake of their daughter and grandson. They converted the basement into a bedroom for Tyler so that he had at least some personal space, and Lisa was given a spare room, but their opportunities to help were limited to that. Both of them were retired teachers, living on modest savings and a small monthly income, which was barely enough for their own needs, not to mention the additional support of Lisa and her son. At that moment, I had just entered my first serious job after graduating from college. This was my chance. I started earning good money, rented my first apartment in the city center. It might not be spacious, but it was my own space, my corner, a symbol of my independence. I made plans for the future, dreamed of career growth, trips, new experiences. But I didn't know then that a single family dinner would change everything. I remember that Sunday evening down to the smallest detail. We were all sitting at the big wooden table in my parents' house. Mom, Dad, Lisa, Tyler, and me. Tyler talked excitedly about his science project, and I even felt relieved to see that he seemed to have begun to adapt to the new reality. We ate Mom's signature meat stew, discussed daily chores, and laughed. But as soon as we finished dessert, the atmosphere in the room changed. Dad cleared his throat, which always meant the beginning of an important conversation. "Sophia, we need to discuss something important," he began, putting down his spoon and looking at me with an expression that showed uncertainty. Mom, who was sitting across from him, crossed her arms on the table and nodded. "It's about Lisa." I glanced at my sister, but she looked down at her plate, avoiding my gaze. "Lisa is having a hard time right now," her father continued. "Yes, she found a job at a department store, but you do understand how much they pay there. And Tyler is growing up fast. He constantly needs new clothes, school supplies, and just a normal life." I nodded. Of course I understood. "We thought—" Mom spoke carefully, obviously choosing her words. "Since you've done so well at work, maybe you could help your sister a little." I wasn't surprised. Deep down, I knew this conversation would happen someday. I understood the situation perfectly and was not going to refuse help, but I wanted to be at least asked and not confronted with the fact. "Of course I'll help," I said, suppressing my irritation. "What amount do you have in mind?" Mom and Dad exchanged glances. Then Mom cautiously suggested, "Maybe $700 a month?" It was a lot of money for me. I could afford to pay that kind of money, but it would mean that I would have to give up some of my own pleasures, postpone some plans, sacrifice something personal. But what could I do? Lisa was my sister, and Tyler was my only nephew. "Okay," I replied after a short pause. "I can do it." Lisa looked up at me, full of relief and gratitude, her lips trembling. "Thank you, Sophia. This will help so much," she whispered. And so, without further ado, I became their permanent sponsor. Since that month, without missing a beat, I've been transferring $700 to Lisa, just like I paid rent or utility bills. It has become routine. It's become a habit. This has become the new reality of my life. As Tyler grew up, his needs began to go beyond the usual childhood needs, and he needed more than just new clothes or school supplies. He showed a keen interest in programming, enthusiastically read articles about game development, and dreamed of creating something of his own one day, and he also wanted to learn foreign languages. And when he first told me about it, his eyes shone with genuine enthusiasm, which it would be a crime not to support. It seemed to me that these were wonderful hobbies that could open up prospects for him and give him a better future. So I decided without hesitation to help and enrolled him in courses, paying for them as a gift for his 11th birthday. That year, I also fulfilled his cherished dream. I bought him a PlayStation 5, which he talked about almost every time he saw an advertisement or heard classmates talking. I will never forget how his eyes lit up when he tore open the packaging and saw the cherished box. This moment of delight, genuine childish joy, was worth all the work that I had to take on myself to afford such a gift. The following year, on his 12th birthday, I gave him a new smartphone, and for Christmas, I chose good headphones for him. I always tried to find out what fascinates him at one time or another in order to give him really meaningful gifts. I wanted him to have good things, despite his parents' divorce, despite the fact that his father chose to disappear from his life, and his mother could barely cope with work and daily worries. Eventually, Lisa was able to move out from her parents. She found a small but cozy 2-room apartment where she and Tyler could finally feel at least a little independent. I knew she needed help, so I helped her with the deposit and the first 3 months of rent so they could settle in without worrying about how to make ends meet. I often visited them, brought groceries, and picked them up for dinner when the whole family gathered at my parents' house, which happened at least twice a month. Lisa talked a lot at these dinners, but most of the time it wasn't about work or raising her son, but about her search for a new love. She plunged headlong into the world of online dating, changing apps like Gloves, meeting different men, jumping from one fleeting hobby to another. It seemed to me that she just wanted to fill the void, but she preferred to talk about regular dates with delight and hope, as if each next man was supposed to be the one who would solve all her problems. She rarely talked about work, but I knew from my parents that she had never been able to stay in any position. An administrator in a store, a waitress, an office assistant, a boutique consultant. She seemed to be rushing around in search of something that would suit her perfectly, but she did not stay anywhere long enough to build at least some kind of career. Most of her daily expenses continued to be covered by her parents. Their small retirement income was distributed among her needs, and my money went to everything else, to Tyler's courses, his belongings, entertainment, and those moments of joy that I did not want to take away from him. A year has passed since I first agreed to help Lisa, and during that time, a lot has changed in my own life. I got a significant raise at work, my salary almost doubled, and this was an important step forward for me. It seemed to me that now that I had more financial stability, I could finally think about myself, about my own future, and I firmly decided to start saving money for a down payment on my own apartment in order to stop endlessly renting. At another family dinner, when Dad, as usual, asked me how things were going at work, I did not hide the good news and replied with a smile, "Actually, I have great news." I felt everything inside rejoicing at the realization of my success. I got a promotion. Now I earn almost twice as much as before, and I'm thinking of starting saving for my own place. Before I could finish, Lisa abruptly raised her head. Her gaze instantly became wary, and the icy note that I remembered from childhood slipped into her voice. "Promotion? What is it?" she asked, clearly focusing not on the fact of my success itself, but on its material side. "How much do you earn now?" I hesitated, but I answered honestly anyway. "Almost twice as much as before." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned forward, clasping her fingers together. "Well," she said slowly, as if considering every word, "if you earn twice as much now, isn't it logical that you can afford to help me twice as much?" I froze, as if struck by this thought that hadn't even occurred to me. "You mean $1,400 a month?" I almost gasped in surprise. "Yes," Lisa shrugged. "Isn't that fair? Since you're getting more now, Tyler and I should win too. We are a family, Sophia." I looked at my parents, expecting them to at least try to say something to reason with her, but they just nodded understandingly, and Mom said softly, "Lisa is right. The family helps the family, dear. Besides, you don't have children of your own. You don't need so many expenses." I felt an unpleasant heaviness spreading in my chest. I was confronted with a fact. I was left with no choice, and the gaze of 3 pairs of eyes fixed on me pressed down with such weight that I could almost physically feel this pressure. Tyler didn't participate in this conversation. He went to visit a friend after dinner, and maybe that's why I was so offended. It wasn't for his sake that I was being forced to pay more, but for the sake of something else, alien and unpleasant. "Actually," Lisa said, leaning forward even closer, "500 would be even better. Tyler's getting braces soon, and his programming courses are getting more expensive too." I opened my mouth to protest, to somehow defend my boundaries, but feeling that it was useless, I nodded. "Great, $500 a month," I said, and the voice in my own ears sounded strange to me. But as I drove home that evening, looking at the twinkling lights of the city at night, I felt for the first time that my life was no longer just mine. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that there was something wrong with this agreement, that it looked less and less like voluntary help and more like something mandatory, programmed and expected, like a tax or a monthly utility bill that couldn't be ignored. Every month, when $500 left my account, disappearing somewhere in Lisa and Tyler's lives. And although it was a significant amount for me, I continued to convince myself that this was a temporary measure, that Lisa would definitely find a stable job, get back on her feet, and Tyler, when he got older, would stop depending so much from our financial support. But as the months went by, the situation remained unchanged. I cut back on my own expenses, gave up some of the usual pleasures, revised my financial plans, increased the savings period for the initial payment for housing, but I was coping. And therefore, at some point, it seemed to me that everything was going the way it should go, that the sacrifices I make are fully justified. When Tyler turned 13, I thought about a gift that, on the one hand, would bring him joy, and on the other would become a symbolic boundary between what I was willing to give and what I shouldn't expect. That day, I arrived at my parents' house with an electric scooter, choosing it instead of another expensive gadget or gaming device, deciding that it would be both practical and useful for a teenager. Tyler was really happy with the gift. His eyes lit up when he unwrapped the package and immediately began to look at the new transport. But Lisa sat in the corner all evening with an expression of sour disappointment on her face. And I didn't even need to ask what was the matter. She clearly expected something more, and perhaps she even made plans in advance for what else she could buy with the money she thought I was going to spend. The next 2 years passed in the same rhythm. I continued to transfer money, but at the same time, I began to notice that Lisa's social networks were increasingly showing photos of her posing in expensive restaurants, posting pictures of new outfits, and also showing off spontaneous weekend trips to neighboring states. I couldn't help but wonder how a part-time retail worker could afford such a lifestyle, especially considering that even with my help, they still complained about the lack of money. Meanwhile, I wasn't sitting idly by. I was working overtime, taking on additional projects, giving up vacations, and diligently saving for my future apartment, realizing that I no longer wanted to depend on rental housing and dreaming of finally having something of my own, even a small one. And at the age of 31, I finally succeeded. I bought my first apartment, albeit not luxurious, but quite a cozy studio in a good, though not an elite area. My entire down payment was spent on the purchase, and the mortgage payments turned out to be significant. But it didn't matter, because for the first time in my life I felt really proud of myself, for my independence, and for being able to achieve this goal without anyone's help. I decided to have a housewarming party. I invited friends, colleagues, neighbors, family, and when Lisa and Tyler entered my new apartment, I immediately noticed how her gaze darted around, examining every detail, evaluating furniture, appliances, and furnishings, as if calculating how much it all cost. Tyler, who was already 14 at the time, muttered a quick congratulations and then immediately asked for the Wi-Fi password, which made me smile involuntarily. Teenagers, after all, always remain teenagers. But after a while, when I was in the kitchen, filling bowls with snacks, I accidentally heard Lisa, standing in another room, whispering to one of our cousins, "Tyler and I deserve this place more than she does." We're still crammed into that tiny rented apartment. My hand froze halfway to the plate of chips. The unfairness of her words stung me more than I expected, but I decided not to react, not to get into an argument, not to let her ruin my special day because, after all, this was my home, my result of many years of work, my achievement which had nothing to do with her and her problems. But over the next year, I noticed a new disturbing trend. Tyler, who was now 15, began to talk about cars more and more often. He talked about friends whose parents were already planning to buy them cars by their 16th birthday, unobtrusively mentioned models that he considered cool. With a slight grin, he wondered if I was going to support him in this matter. At first, I didn't think much of it. Most teenagers can't wait to get a driver's license, and they enthusiastically discuss cars. But soon, I noticed something strange. Lisa started posting photos of Tyler standing next to expensive cars in car dealerships on social media, and the captions to these pictures hinted at something more than just dreams. "What a wonderful feeling it is to be happy for someone's future birthday," one caption read. In another photo, Tyler was driving a new Audi, and under the photo, Lisa wrote, "Trying out the car of his dreams. Now we're just waiting for a generous fairy godmother to make it a reality." I laughed when I saw this post. The manipulation was so obvious that it was almost comical, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I had an unpleasant feeling that this was not just a joke. I saw Lisa's expression contort with rage, her lips pressed tightly together, and her eyes flashed with such anger that if a look could kill, I would already be lying lifeless right here in the living room of my parents' house, among balloons and festive garlands, among stunned relatives and friends who were now looking at me. Me, then at Tyler, who was still standing with a sulky look, arms crossed over his chest, like an offended child who has refused to buy the desired toy. "You can't be serious." Lisa finally unclenched her teeth, her voice trembling with indignation, and I realized that in her mind my refusal was something impossible, something that did not fit into the usual picture of the world, where I always paid, always adjusted, always found a way to satisfy them. Needs. Are you really going to take his gift just like that? "He doesn't want him," I shrugged, trying to speak calmly, but my voice was shaking too, and I felt a storm of resentment and fatigue boiling inside me. I thought that a good, expensive phone was a practical and necessary thing, but apparently I was mistaken. If you are not satisfied with the gift, I will find another use for it. Tyler clenched his fists, his face flushed, and he shot me a withering look. "You could have given me something normal," he blurted out, stamping his foot, and at that moment he seemed to me not like a teenager who had just turned 16, but a moody kid who was lying on the floor in a store, demanding candy. "You know I need a car." I grinned, even though my stomach was clenching with pain. Need is a very big word, Tyler. A car is not a basic necessity, but a luxury, and if your mother decided that I had to buy it for you, then she was very mistaken. Lisa took a sharp step forward, and now there was less than a meter between us. "Wrong," she repeated, narrowing her eyes. "Sophia, let's be honest. You have money. You can afford it without any problems. You bought yourself an apartment. You earn well. You don't have your own children to spend money on. So why can't you help your nephew?" I couldn't believe my ears. "Help me." "Lisa, I've paid for his courses, his birthdays, his gadgets, even part of your rent. I've given you tens of thousands of dollars over the years, but apparently it wasn't enough." "Yes, it's not enough. Stop it," she shouted, and a heavy silence fell in the room. I looked at my parents. looking for some kind of support. But my mother looked away, and my father just sighed heavily, as if he was trying to find words but could not find what to say. And at that moment, I realized that they would not interfere. They would not take my side, because in their eyes, I was selfish, refusing to help my family, even though that was all I had been doing all my life. I clenched my teeth, tightened my grip on the phone box, and took a deep breath. "Okay," I said, feeling like everything inside me was finally breaking down, like the last thread that still connected me to this circle of endless exploitation was dissolving. If that's the case, then let's put all the dots over the "and." I won't give you another penny. Lisa recoiled as if I had just hit her. "You can't." "I can," I interrupted, my resolve growing stronger by the second. "As of today, I will stop financing your life. If Tyler wants a car, let him earn it himself. If you can't afford everything you want, that's your problem, not mine." Tyler snorted, rolled his eyes, and pointedly turned away. "God, you're so greedy." I laughed bitterly. "Greedy? No, Tyler, I just won't let you use me anymore." Lisa continued to stare at me with wide eyes, her lips trembling. But when she realized that I would not back down, her face contorted with anger, and she abruptly turned on her heel. "Fuck you, Sophia." She grabbed Tyler's arm and pulled him towards the exit. He didn't resist, but he didn't even look at me as he passed. The door slammed shut. There was a deafening silence in the room. I looked around at the crowd, friends, relatives, neighbors, who were standing with awkward expressions on their faces, clearly not knowing how to react to this performance. Someone looked away. Someone pretended to be interested in the festive napkins on the table, and only my parents continued to sit in their seats, tense, silent. But in their looks, I read not support, but disappointment. "You're being too harsh, Sophia," Mom finally said, and I felt a new fire burning inside me. Not rage, no, but pain, bitterness, resentment. I took a deep breath and then said slowly, clearly, "No, Mom, I did the right thing, and I won't change my mind." I put my phone in my bag, turned around, and without looking at anyone else, left the room, feeling that with this step I was finally closing an important, too difficult chapter of my life. There was a ringing silence in the apartment, so deep and dense that I could clearly hear my own breathing, ragged and heavy, as if I had just run a marathon. My fingers were still clutching the phone, on the screen of which the completed call icon was flashing, but I didn't let go of it, as if expecting Lisa to call back, that she wouldn't believe it, wouldn't accept it, that she would try again to push me, break me, make me change my mind. But the call didn't come. And instead of relief, a wave of devastation washed over me, so powerful that for a moment I felt like I was thrown overboard, trapped in icy water, not knowing where to swim. I closed my eyes, and a painful burning sensation spread through my chest, a mixture of resentment, anger, and final clarity that came to me too late. 6 years of my life have been spent on other people's desires, other people's comforts, other people's requests, and now that I've finally said no, I've been charged with selfishness, as if taking care of myself has become a crime. Taking a deep breath, I threw the phone on the couch and stood up, feeling my legs grow heavy, as if my body was filled with lead. I went to the kitchen cupboard, took out a bottle of wine, splashed some into a glass, and took a sip, hoping that it would help me relax, but inside there was only emptiness. For the first time in many years, I no longer had to worry about other people's bills, about someone else's needs, about whether there would be enough money until the next paycheck if Lisa asked for something very urgent again. I no longer had to flinch from my parents' calls. I didn't have to justify how I was managing my own life, but for some reason, instead of freedom, I felt only a painful realization of how long I had allowed myself to be used. The night passed in an anxious, restless sleep, and when I woke up in the morning, for the first few seconds, I still wasn't fully aware of what had happened. But as soon as I picked up my phone and saw the complete absence of notifications, reality hit me with renewed force. No one wrote, no one called. I was crossed out. At work, I answered emails mechanically, participated in video calls, discussed projects, but it was like it was behind a glass partition, distant, muffled, not real. At some point, I noticed that I had unconsciously opened Lisa's profile on a social network, although I had recently blocked her. But despite this, I knew that she had probably already managed to expose herself as a victim, write a long post about betrayal, about the cruelty of loved ones, and I could almost imagine what kind of comments they leave our mutual friends, how they sympathize with her, write how heartless I am, how cold I am. But deep down, I didn't care anymore. A week passed, then another. None of them tried to find me, and I didn't try to get in touch first. I tried to fill the void with something useful. I joined a gym, started meeting friends more often than before, and finally allowed myself to spend money on myself instead of on other people's whims. But loneliness, creeping imperceptibly, squeezed me in its cold embrace. One evening, after returning home from work, I put my phone on silent mode and turned on the TV, trying to distract myself. But my thoughts still returned to Lisa, to Tyler, to my parents, to their expectations, to their accusations. I didn't miss the manipulations, their endless demands, but deep down it hurt me to realize that the bond between us, even despite all its toxicity, had been completely severed. The next day, when I was leaving the office, my phone vibrated. I automatically looked at the screen and froze. It was a number I didn't recognize. For a second, I thought it was one of my colleagues or a random spam call, but something inside me told me that wasn't the case. I pressed the green button. Hello? There was silence on the other end, but then I heard a quiet, hesitating voice. Hello, Aunt Sophia. I felt my heart tighten, but I didn't allow myself to show emotion. Hi, Tyler, I replied calmly but cautiously. Why are you calling? He paused. His voice sounded uncertain, but it lacked the old audacity, the confidence that everything should go according to his script. I just wanted to say, I do not know. Excuse me? I clenched my fingers on the phone. For what exactly? There was silence again, long and painful. For everything, he finally exhaled. For that party. For the way I behaved. For Mom. I didn't know what to say. That doesn't justify everything, I finally said. I know, he sighed. I miss. And then, for the first time in all these weeks, I allowed myself to feel something other than pain. Me too, Tyler. There was silence on the line, but it no longer seemed heavy or tense. Would you like to meet? Just to talk? I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and thought for a moment before answering. I didn't know if I would ever be able to completely forgive everything that had happened, and I didn't know if I was ready to let someone from my family back into my life. But there was sincerity in Tyler's voice, a new note I didn't recognize. And maybe this conversation could be the beginning of something new. Okay, I said, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to weigh every word. Let's meet. I knew that I had made the only right choice, even if it was painful, even if there was still a faint, barely perceptible voice in me whispering that the family should stick together. But isn't family about support, caring, and respect for each other? Shouldn't a real family appreciate your efforts rather than take them for granted? I tried not to think about it too often, but on particularly quiet evenings, when I was sitting in my cozy apartment with a book and a cup of tea, when there was that special silence in the air that used to be filled with calls, requests, demands, I involuntarily returned to those moments when I unconditionally believed that my help, it is something that is appreciated, that is perceived as an act of love, not as a duty. 9 months have passed since that party, after which I severed all ties with Lisa and my parents. I had more freedom, more air, more opportunities in my life. I could afford small joys that previously seemed unattainable. I bought a subscription to a good fitness club, enrolled in Spanish courses that I had long dreamed of, and started traveling, even if only within the country. But it was already something that. I met new people, made friends, and learned how to spend time the way I wanted to, rather than the way circumstances required of me. I no longer looked back at the phone in fear, not afraid that the next call would bring with it a new request or accusation. I no longer felt obligated to make excuses for how I was managing my own money. nor did I feel guilty for living the way I wanted to. But deep down, there was a residue, not from the fact that I stopped helping, but from how easily they cut me out, how quickly I turned from a beloved daughter and caring sister into an outcast, into a person who was spoken of only with contempt or pity. Sometimes I heard news about Lisa from Emma's cousin, from distant relatives who were not involved in this family conflict and just casually mentioned her in conversations. I found out that she had to move to a cheaper apartment, that she finally got a stable job in an office, that Tyler quit programming and now works part-time in a cafe, that her parents are still unhappy that I don't send them money, and at every opportunity remind others about it. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, I was overcome by a wave of doubts. Wasn't I too cruel? Too harsh? Shouldn't I have left at least a small financial channel so that they wouldn't experience such difficulties? But then I would see Tyler's face contemptuously tossing aside an expensive gift, Lisa's expression when she demanded a car, my mother's accusing look as if I had committed a mortal sin by refusing to be an eternal source of money. I sighed and shook my head, pushing these thoughts away. I made a choice, and it was the right choice. One autumn day when the city was already covered in gold and crimson colors and the air smelled of wet leaves and freshness, I decided to take a walk in the park after work. I wanted to enjoy a rare moment of peace, to absorb this feeling of freedom, which still seemed to me new, unusual, but so desirable. I had just turned onto the central alley when I noticed a familiar figure. Tyler. He was sitting on a bench with his head bent over his phone, and he looked completely different from how I remembered him. He had grown much taller and matured, but there was a weariness in his posture, a kind of loss that I hadn't noticed before. I slowed my pace, hesitating, not knowing whether to approach, but at that moment he raised his head and met my gaze. Aunt Sophia? I stopped. Hey, Tyler. He hesitated for a moment, as if he didn't know whether to be happy or not, but then slowly nodded. Hello? There was an awkward silence. I didn't know what to say. How are you? I finally asked, even though it sounded so corny. Tyler shrugged his shoulders. It's fine, I work and study. Mom and I have another apartment now, smaller, but it's even better. Hush, calm down. I noticed how he avoided making eye contact with me. That's good, I said sincerely. I'm glad you're okay. He nodded, looking away again, and then suddenly exhaled and ran his hand through his hair. I mean, I know I was an idiot at the party that night, and Mom too. It was wrong. I looked at him carefully. Yes, Tyler, that was wrong. He sighed. I don't want it to end like this. I miss. I felt something tremble inside, but I didn't allow myself to soften immediately. Tyler, you have to understand that I can't go back to what happened. I can't become a person who can be used again. I know. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw in his eyes not a childish moodiness, not an expectation of profit, but real sincerity. I really got it. I took a deep breath. Then why don't we start small? Just meet up, talk without any expectations? He smiled for the first time in this conversation, really, openly. I'd like that. Me too. And the moment we started talking again, when we started rebuilding something real step by step and not based on money and expectations, I realized that maybe this was a new chance, not for them, not for me, but for both of us. A few more weeks passed, and our communication with Tyler became something stable, quiet, and cautious, as if we were both afraid of scaring off the delicate balance that we had begun to build after such a long period of estrangement. We didn't talk about the past, we didn't touch on topics that could rekindle resentments, but every conversation we had, every meeting filled me with a strange, unusual feeling, as if for the first time in many years, I was communicating with someone from my family, not because something was expected of me, not because I was assigned the role of sponsor, but simply because we both wanted it. Tyler has changed. He no longer spoke in hints, did not try to take advantage of our communication, did not look at me with that expression of expectation that I had seen so often before. He talked about his work in the store, how he first realized how much money was worth, how he began to appreciate the opportunity to spend it on himself and not just wait for someone else to provide him with a comfortable life. "Do you remember when I said I wanted a car?" he once asked when we were sitting in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. I nodded, sipping my coffee, waiting to see where he was going. Now that I earn my own money, I realize how expensive it is. It seemed to me that it was easy to go out and buy, but when you add up the rent, food, bills, there's not much left. I looked at him carefully. "Are you disappointed?" He shook his head. "No. I just realized that I was misjudging things. When money is easy, when you don't earn it yourself, you feel like you always have it, that you can just take it and get whatever you want. But when you spend 8 hours on your feet in the supermarket, carrying boxes, putting up with annoyed customers, you start to look at it differently." I smiled. "You're growing up, Tyler. This is an important lesson." He was silent for a moment, then looked at me with a slightly embarrassed smile. "I guess I just wanted to say that I understand why you did what you did, and I'm glad you didn't buy me a car then." I laughed. "Oh, that's something new." He shook his head, chuckling. "Yes, I was an idiot then." "An ex-idiot then?" "I'm working on it," he replied with a smile. These conversations, these moments filled with lightness and genuine, sincere understanding, were something new to me. I didn't have to think about when the next request would be made, when the next demand would appear. I didn't feel like a purse on my feet. But at the same time, I had the feeling that Lisa would not leave everything as it is. And I was right. One evening, when I returned from work, my phone rang, and a name that I hadn't seen for almost a year appeared on the screen. Liza. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling anxiety rising inside. I knew that her call couldn't just be random, and it certainly wasn't an attempt to make peace. I accepted the challenge. "What do you need, Lisa?" I asked without preamble. I heard her sigh in exasperation first, and then her icy voice, laced with the same contempt she'd sounded at Tyler's birthday party. "Are you dating my son behind my back?" Tyler decided he wanted to talk to me. It's his choice, and if he didn't tell you, then he had his reasons. "You're trying to win him over again, aren't you?" She spat out sharply. "Do you think if you chat with him sweetly, he'll forget how you left us?" "Lisa, we both know that it wasn't like that at all," I replied calmly, although everything inside me was tense. "I gave you 6 years of financial support, and you still think that I had to continue." She snorted. "It doesn't matter. He's my son, and if you think you can get back into his life without my permission, you're deeply mistaken." I shook my head. "Tyler's not a kid, Lisa. He's almost 17. He makes his own decisions." "He doesn't know what he's doing yet," she exploded. "You're manipulating him, making him feel guilty for what happened." "No, Lisa, you've always been manipulating him and me." There was silence on the other end of the line. "You always said that a family should help a family," I continued, no longer trying to soften my words. "But only now I see that for you, it meant only one thing. I have to help you, and you just have to take." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've become so smug. You think you're above us now, don't you? With your apartment, with your career?" "No, Lisa, I just learned to say no." "He's my son," she repeated, and I could hear the real fury in her voice. "And I forbid you to meet him." I took a deep breath. "You can't forbid it, Lisa." "You'll see how you can date him when he's gone," she said sharply. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She grinned. "I'm planning a move. As soon as Tyler finishes school, we'll move to another city." My heart sank. "Is this his decision?" "Is this my decision?" she replied coldly. "And no matter how hard you try, Sophia, you can't change that." I gritted my teeth. "Tyler will decide for himself what he wants. He's a kid. He's almost an adult," I reminded her. But Lisa was no longer listening. "You're just jealous that you'll never have a family," she spat. "You've always been alone, and you always will be, because you're an egotist who thinks only of yourself." I felt rage flare up inside me, but I didn't let it get out. "I'm done talking to you, Lisa," I said in a flat voice, "and it's time for you to learn how to let me go, too." I hung up the phone, put it on the table, and took a deep breath. I didn't know what Tyler would do, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Lisa run my life anymore. 8 months have passed since the evening when Tyler and I sat down at the same table for the first time in a long time, and just talked, without demands, without expectations, without manipulations that have poisoned our relationship for so long. Since then, we've developed a special routine. We met every couple of weeks. Sometimes we had dinner together in small cafes where it wasn't too crowded. Sometimes we just walked through the streets of the city, watching his life, laughing at random scenes, sharing the news, like two people who finally found a common language after many years of misunderstanding. Tyler had changed a lot during this time. He had matured, and it wasn't just that he had grown taller, but that his face had the features of an adult man, and his voice had grown stronger and deeper. He changed from the inside out. I could see it in his eyes, in his posture, in the way he chose his words, the way he spoke without avoiding difficult topics, the way he learned to admit mistakes. Last week, he told me that he had been promoted at the store, and his face shone with pride, the same one that I had wanted to see in him for so long, but which appeared only now that he began to truly understand what it means to achieve everything on his own. "I'm the shift supervisor now," he said with a smile that showed both satisfaction and a slight, barely perceptible uncertainty. "That's fantastic, Tyler," I replied sincerely, because I was really proud of him. He was a little embarrassed, but continued anyway. "I like the feeling that I'm doing something important, and I'm saving up for a used car," he added, slightly lowering his gaze, as if waiting for my reaction. "Nothing special, just something reliable for movement." I nodded, appreciating the irony of that moment, but I didn't say it out loud. Tyler, who had once thrown a tantrum because he hadn't gotten an expensive, luxurious car, was now saving up for a modest, practical option. And it was better than any apology, because it meant that he himself, without pressure, without guidance, realized the value of work, understood the difference between whims and real needs. Our conversations never involved asking for money, and I didn't offer it. Now there was a pure, incorruptible bond between us, built not on financial dependence, but on something more, something sincere. Tyler shared his successes with me, sometimes talked about difficulties, asked for advice, but never about money. And this was the main change that meant much more to me than any words. As for Lisa and my parents, I haven't spoken to any of them since that day at my apartment door when they tried to force me back into the role I finally escaped from. I knew from Tyler and from distant relatives that Lisa was still experiencing financial difficulties, that she had never been able to find stability, that she was continuing to change jobs in an attempt to stay afloat, but she did not stay in any position long enough to build a career. Her parents, as before, supported her, paid the rent when she couldn't cope, helped with the costs of Tyler's school, but I couldn't help but think that maybe someday they would get tired. They would realize that Lisa would never learn to be independent until someone was always there. I'm ready to lend her a shoulder. Sometimes I wondered if I should try to establish a relationship with them, take the first step, try to understand them, give them a chance to fix what was destroyed. But every time these thoughts came to my mind, I remembered their cold, accusing words, remembered how they treated me not as a daughter or sister, but as a resource that could be endlessly exploited. And then I realized that the wound was still too fresh, that the betrayal had turned out to be too deep for me to just forget about everything and re-enter this circle. Maybe one day I'll be ready to forgive them, but not now. I focused on my life, on my job, on my well-being, on those few but valuable relationships that really deserved to be preserved. Tyler, knowing how things were going between Lisa and me, never insisted that I communicate with her, never tried to reconcile us, and I was grateful to him for that. "Mom still gets mad when someone mentions your name," he confessed to me one day as we walked through the evening city, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. "And Grandma and Grandpa are on her side, so I think it's better for now if they don't find out that we're communicating." I just nodded because I hadn't expected anything else from them for a long time. But despite this, despite all the resentments and disappointments, I found peace. Without having to support Lisa, without the endless demands, without the guilt that has been squeezing me for many years, my financial situation has improved significantly. I was finally able to furnish my apartment the way I wanted, created a reliable financial reserve, and even started planning my first real vacation in a long time. But more importantly, I've learned to set boundaries. I've learned the difference between generosity and exploitation. I realize that family is not only blood, but also a choice, that those who really love should not demand, use, blame, that caring cannot be one-sided, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to say no. Last week, I ran into my mom at the grocery store. It was an ordinary day, an ordinary grocery shopping trip, and I never expected to see her among the rows of fruits. Our eyes met for a moment, and I thought that maybe she would come up to me, that maybe something would happen that would at least remind me that we were once a family. But instead, she turned the cart around and walked off in the opposite direction without even looking back. It was painful, but I realized that some bridges take a very long time to repair, and some do not recover at all. I'm not closing the doors forever, but I'm in no hurry to open them either. Time will tell what will happen next.